the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. On a warm summer morning in the city of Sarajevo, a driver made a wrong turn, and the world changed forever. In the space of about 90 seconds, a 19-year-old with a pistol did what 6 other conspirators had failed to do that day, killing a man and his wife and setting off a chain of political and military decisions that would, within 6 weeks, plunge Europe into a war that killed roughly 20 million people. This is the story of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the young men behind it, the empire that failed to protect him, and the single wrong turn that helped ignite the First World War. To understand why an heir to a European throne was gunned down on a street corner in the Balkans, you first have to understand the powder keg that region had become by 1914. For centuries, the Balkans had been contested territory between 2 crumbling empires, the Ottoman Empire, whose control over the region had been steadily receding for generations, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a vast, multi-ethnic monarchy ruled from Vienna and Budapest that controlled territories stretching across much of Central Europe. In 1908, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, a territory it had administered since 1878, but that technically still belonged to the Ottoman Empire on paper, a move that infuriated the neighboring kingdom of Serbia, a small but fiercely independent Slavic nation that harbored its own ambitions of uniting the South Slavic peoples of the region, including the large Serb population living within Bosnia itself, under a single greater Serbian state. The Austro-Hungarian Empire that Franz Ferdinand stood to inherit was itself a fragile construction, an unwieldy union of more than a dozen distinct nationalities: Germans and Hungarians, Czechs and Poles, Croats and Serbs and Slovenes, Romanians and Italians, held together less by shared national identity than by loyalty to the aging figure of Emperor Franz Joseph, who had ruled since 1848 and had, by 1914, already outlived a son who died by suicide, a wife assassinated by an Italian anarchist in 1898, and a brother executed by firing squad in Mexico. A litany of personal tragedy that had made the elderly emperor a figure of both sympathy and increasing political irrelevance as the empire's internal tensions mounted around him. Franz Ferdinand had become heir presumptive only after the death of Franz Joseph's own son, Crown Prince Rudolf, and his relationship with his uncle, the emperor, was notably strained, in no small part, over the emperor's continued disapproval of Franz Ferdinand's marriage to Sophie so many years earlier. This nationalist ambition found violent expression in a secret Serbian nationalist organization known as the Black Hand, formerly called Unification or Death, founded in 1911 by a group of Serbian military officers and led by a man whose code name was Apis, in reality Colonel Dragutin Dimitrijevic, the head of Serbian military intelligence. The Black Hand was dedicated to the liberation and unification of Serbs living outside Serbia's borders, by violent means if necessary, and maintained an extensive network of contacts, weapons, and training camps aimed at fostering exactly this kind of nationalist insurgency within Austro-Hungarian territory, operating with a degree of independence from, and at times outright defiance of, the official Serbian government itself, a distinction that would matter enormously in the political chaos that followed the assassination. The man the Black Hand and its allies ultimately targeted was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, nephew of the aging Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria-Hungary, and heir presumptive to the imperial throne. Franz Ferdinand was, in many respects, an unlikely martyr for Slavic nationalism to claim, since he was known within the Austro-Hungarian court as a relative moderate on the question of the empire's Slavic populations, having expressed sympathy at various points for expanding their political rights within the empire through a proposed restructuring sometimes called trialism, which would have elevated Slavic peoples to a status more equal with the empire's dominant Austrian and Hungarian populations. Paradoxically, this made him, in the eyes of some Serbian nationalists, an even more dangerous figure, since a genuinely reformed and more accommodating Austria-Hungary might undercut the very nationalist grievances that fueled the movement for full South Slavic independence and unification. Despite his relative moderation on the question of the empire's Slavic subjects, Franz Ferdinand was not, by most contemporary accounts, a widely beloved figure even within his own court. Known for a famously volatile temper, an obsessive passion for hunting that reportedly saw him personally kill hundreds of thousands of animals over the course of his lifetime according to his own meticulously kept records, and a reputation for impatience that left him with few close political allies among the empire's aging ruling establishment, many of whom privately viewed his eventual accession to the throne with some apprehension rather than enthusiasm. This relative isolation within the Viennese court would matter in the weeks after his death, as the outpouring of official grief in Austria-Hungary, while genuine at the level of state protocol, lacked the depth of personal mourning that might have accompanied the loss of a more universally cherished figure. A dynamic some historians believe made it psychologically easier for Austro-Hungarian officials to treat his assassination primarily as a strategic opportunity against Serbia, rather than purely as a personal tragedy demanding a measured response. Franz Ferdinand was also a devoted family man, having married Sophie Chotek, a Czech countess, in 1900, a union considered a morganatic marriage under strict Habsburg court protocol, meaning Sophie was regarded as socially beneath her husband's royal rank, despite her own noble lineage, and their children were barred from any future claim to the imperial throne. This distinction meant Sophie was routinely excluded from formal court functions and denied the honors typically accorded to a woman married to the heir to the throne, a source of ongoing personal frustration for the couple, which made the trip they were about to take together all the more meaningful to them, an opportunity for Sophie to appear at her husband's side with something closer to the recognition normally due her position. In June 1914, Franz Ferdinand traveled to Bosnia in his capacity as Inspector General of the Austro-Hungarian Armed Forces to observe military maneuvers being conducted nearby and to pay an official visit to Sarajevo, the provincial capital, scheduled for June 28th. The date itself carried enormous symbolic weight that Austrian officials seemed remarkably indifferent to. June 28th was Vidovdan, or Saint Vitus Day, a solemn and deeply significant date in Serbian national memory, marking the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a defeat that had, over centuries, become a foundational symbol of Serbian national identity and resistance against foreign domination. Scheduling a visit by the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne in Bosnian territory whose annexation Serbian nationalists still deeply resented, on precisely this date, struck many at the time, and even more so in hindsight, as an extraordinary provocation, whether through genuine obliviousness or simple bureaucratic indifference on the part of Austrian officials planning the trip. Learning of the planned visit, the Black Hand working through its network of contacts, recruited and armed a small group of young Bosnian Serb nationalists to carry out an assassination. Chief among them was Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old student, frail in health, having suffered from tuberculosis for years, but fiercely committed to the cause of South Slavic unification, who had been rejected from an earlier Serbian guerrilla organization for being physically too weak. Princip and his fellow conspirators, including Nedeljko Čabrinović, a typesetter, and several others, were recruited and organized with the help of Danilo Ilić, a Bosnian Serb schoolteacher and Black Hand operative who coordinated the group's activities on the ground in Sarajevo, having grown increasingly conflicted, according to later accounts, about the plot in its final days, without ultimately withdrawing his support. The conspirators were supplied with pistols and small bombs smuggled across the border from Serbia with the assistance of Black Hand contacts, and were positioned at intervals along the route. The Archduke's motorcade was scheduled to travel through Sarajevo on the morning of June 28, 1914, a plan that gave multiple young men, several of them still teenagers, successive opportunities to strike as the open-topped car, carrying Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, made its way through the city. The morning began disastrously for the conspiracy, but not in the way that might have prevented tragedy. As the Archduke's motorcade proceeded along the Apel Quay, a street running along the Miljacka River, the first assassin in position, Muhammad Mehmed Basic, lost his nerve and failed to act as the car passed. The second conspirator, Nedeljko Čabrinović, did not hesitate, throwing a hand grenade at the Archduke's vehicle as it approached. The driver, seeing the object thrown toward the car, accelerated, and the bomb bounced off the folded-back convertible roof of the vehicle before exploding beneath the car following behind, wounding several bystanders and occupants of that trailing vehicle, though leaving Franz Ferdinand and Sophie themselves unharmed. Čabrinović, in a panic, swallowed a cyanide pill and jumped into the shallow Miljacka River in an attempt at both suicide and escape. But the poison, likely old and degraded, only made him violently ill rather than killing him. And the river itself was only a few inches deep at that point in summer, allowing police to quickly pull him out and arrest him amid an angry crowd. Remarkably, and against all sound judgment given what had just occurred, Franz Ferdinand insisted on continuing with the day's planned events, first proceeding to the scheduled reception at Sarajevo City Hall, where he reportedly greeted the waiting mayor with visible and understandable anger over the attack. Before the mayor could even begin his prepared remarks, though the Archduke ultimately allowed the ceremony to proceed. Following the reception, Franz Ferdinand made the decision to alter his schedule, insisting on visiting the hospital where those wounded in the earlier bomb attack were being treated, a gesture of concern for the injured that would, through a subsequent breakdown in communication, place him directly in the path of the one conspirator still positioned along the original route and still determined to complete the assassination. Here occurred one of history's most consequential logistical failures. Franz Ferdinand's security detail and driver were informed of the change in route, intended to bypass the city center and travel a more direct path to the hospital. But this crucial change was not properly communicated to the lead driver of the motorcade, a man named Leopold Loika. As the procession proceeded, Loika, following the original planned route rather than the revised one, turned onto Franz Josef Street, following the Archduke's original scheduled path directly past a delicatessen called Moritz Schiller's shop, where Gavrilo Princip happened to be standing, having assumed, after the failed bombing earlier that morning, that the assassination attempt had been abandoned entirely, and the day's opportunity lost. When officials in the car realized the driver's error, they called out for him to stop and reverse course, and Loika, attempting to correct his mistake, brought the vehicle to a halt directly in front of Princip, who suddenly found himself standing mere feet away from the very target he had traveled to Sarajevo to kill. Princip stepped forward, drew his pistol, a Belgian-made FN model 1910, and fired twice at extremely close range. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. According to witnesses, as the fatally wounded Archduke realized his wife had also been shot, he was heard pleading with her to stay alive for the sake of their children, unaware that she was already dying, or perhaps already dead from her own wound. Franz Ferdinand himself lost consciousness within minutes and died shortly afterward, the couple succumbing to their wounds within roughly the same span of time. On the morning of June 28, 1914, having been married for not quite 14 years, Princip, like Chabrinovich before him, attempted to take his own cyanide capsule and was similarly unsuccessful, the aged poison again failing to kill, and he too attempted to escape but was quickly seized by bystanders and police at the scene, badly beaten by the surrounding crowd before authorities managed to take him into custody. Because he was 19 years old at the time of the assassination, just shy of the age of 20 required under Austro-Hungarian law for a death sentence, Princip escaped execution and was instead sentenced to 20 years of hard imprisonment. He would not live to see the war his actions helped unleash come to its end, dying in an Austro-Hungarian prison in April 1918, weakened by tuberculosis and the harsh conditions of his confinement, several months before the armistice that finally ended the First World War. The assassination, though a genuine shock, did not immediately trigger war. Instead, it set off a slow-moving and increasingly ominous diplomatic crisis historians call the July Crisis, as Austro-Hungarian officials, convinced correctly that the Serbian government bore at least indirect responsibility through its toleration, if not outright complicity, in the activities of groups like the Black Hand, sought a pretext to punish and diminish Serbia as a regional rival once and for all. Crucially, Austria-Hungary first sought and received assurance of unconditional support from its powerful ally, the German Empire, a commitment historians often refer to as the blank check, given by German Kaiser Wilhelm II and his government in early July 1914, emboldening Austro-Hungarian leaders, including Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold, to pursue a harder line than they might otherwise have dared. This dense web of alliances did not emerge overnight, but had been building for decades as Europe's great powers, driven by imperial rivalry, industrial competition, and an accelerating arms race, particularly the naval build-up between Britain and Germany that had strained relations between the two powers for years before 1914, sorted themselves into two broad and increasingly rigid camps: the Triple Alliance binding Germany, Austria-Hungary, and more loosely, Italy, and the Triple Entente, linking France, Russia, and Britain. Military planners across the continent had, over the preceding years, developed detailed mobilization timetables built on the assumption that speed of deployment would prove decisive in any future conflict. Timetables that, once activated, left political leaders remarkably little room to pause, reconsider, or de-escalate once the machinery of mobilization had formally begun turning. On July 23, 1914, Nearly a month after the assassination, Austro-Hungary delivered an extraordinarily harsh ultimatum to Serbia containing demands so severe, including provisions that would have allowed Austro-Hungarian officials to participate directly in investigations conducted on Serbian soil, that many observers at the time and since have concluded it was deliberately crafted to be rejected, providing the justification Austro-Hungarian leadership sought for military action. Serbia's response, delivered within the tight deadline given, agreed to nearly all of the ultimatum's demands, but stopped short of accepting every single provision, particularly those touching most directly on Serbian sovereignty, a response the German Kaiser himself, upon reading it, reportedly judged should have been sufficient to avert war. Austria-Hungary judged otherwise, declaring war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination in Sarajevo. What followed was a rapid, and in retrospect, almost mechanical collapse into general European war, driven by a dense web of military alliances and mobilization plans that, once set into motion, proved extraordinarily difficult to reverse. Russia, bound by ties of Slavic solidarity and its own strategic interests in the Balkans, began mobilizing its army in support of Serbia. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, and increasingly alarmed by Russian mobilization, declared war on Russia on August 1st, 1914, and following the strategic logic of a long-prepared military plan known as the Schlieffen Plan, which called for a rapid strike against France before turning to face Russia in the east, declared war on France on August 3rd and invaded neutral Belgium the following day in order to reach French territory more quickly. Britain, bound by a long-standing treaty obligation to protect Belgian neutrality and increasingly wary of German ambitions on the continent, declared war on Germany on August 4th, 1914. Within a period of little more than a week, the assassination of a single archduke in a provincial Balkan city had drawn nearly every major European power into a general continental war, one that would soon draw in colonies and allies from across the globe as well. The war that followed, which contemporaries initially called simply the Great War, lasted more than 4 years and killed an estimated 9 to 11 million military personnel, along with several million more civilian deaths, introducing the world to the horrors of industrialized trench warfare, poison gas, and combat on a scale never before witnessed in human history. It would ultimately topple 4 major empires, the Austro-Hungarian, German, Russian, and Ottoman, redraw the political map of Europe and the Middle East entirely, and through the harsh peace terms imposed on defeated Germany and the political and economic instability that followed, help lay much of the groundwork for the rise of fascism and the outbreak of an even more catastrophic Second World War barely 2 decades later. The funeral that followed was, by the standards of Habsburg royal tradition, strikingly muted, a final indignity imposed by the same rigid court protocol that had governed Sophie's status throughout her marriage. Because Sophie was not considered of sufficiently royal blood, her coffin at the funeral procession in Vienna was positioned lower than her husband's and denied the full royal honors he received, and the couple's children, still barred from any claim to the throne, were left in the care of a guardian rather than inheriting their father's position. Court officials limited the state funeral to a brief and comparatively modest ceremony, and neither Kaiser Wilhelm nor most other reigning European monarchs personally attended, whether from genuine scheduling constraints or a simple lack of urgency about a death that, at that early moment, few yet understood would become the opening act of a world war. In Sarajevo itself, News of the assassination triggered a wave of anti-Serb violence in the days that immediately followed, as segments of the city's Croat and Muslim population, inflamed by the killing of the heir to the throne within their own city, attacked Serb-owned shops, homes, and institutions. Violence that spread to other towns across Bosnia and Herzegovina before Austro-Hungarian authorities moved to restore order, a grim preview of the ethnic and religious tensions that would resurface with even greater violence in the same region generations later. Authorities also moved quickly against the wider conspiracy, and beyond Princip and Chabrinovic, several other participants were tried alongside them in a joint proceeding that October. Danilo Ilic, judged to have played a central organizing role despite his last-minute doubts, was sentenced to death and hanged in February 1915, while several younger conspirators, protected as Princip had been by their age, received lengthy prison terms rather than execution. Colonel Dragutin Dmitrievich, the Black Hand leader who had helped set the plot in motion from Belgrade, would survive the assassination's aftermath for several more years, only to be arrested, tried, and executed by the Serbian government itself in 1917, amid a separate and complicated wartime power struggle. A strange and largely unrelated end for the man whose organization had done so much to bring the war about in the first place. Historians have long debated, and continue to debate, precisely how much responsibility to assign to the assassination itself versus the deeper structural tensions, alliance systems, nationalist ambitions, and militarist assumptions that had been building across Europe for decades before Princip ever fired his pistol on Franz Josef Street. Most agree that the assassination functioned less as the sole cause of the First World War than as the spark that ignited a European continent already saturated with the flammable material of rival alliances, imperial ambition, and an arms race that had been accelerating for years. A powder keg that, in the judgment of many historians, some other crisis might well have ignited in time, even without the events in Sarajevo that June morning. But it was this particular spark, one wrong turn by a nervous driver, one panicked, uncertain group of young conspirators, and one 19-year-old standing almost by pure accident, exactly where history needed him to be, that set the actual chain of events in motion and forever linked the name Sarajevo and the name Gavrilo Princip to the beginning of a war that reshaped the entire 20th century that followed. The streets of Sarajevo are quiet today, but the echoes of June 28th, 1914 still reach across history. What began with one assassination became a conflict that reshaped nations, ended empires, and changed the lives of millions across the world. The events you've seen today remind us that history is not only written by kings, generals, and governments. Sometimes it is changed by ordinary people making extraordinary choices, and by consequences that no one could have fully imagined. At the Retro Review, our goal is not to decide who was right or wrong. We simply revisit the past, understand what happened, and leave the final judgment to you. What do you think? Was the assassination the true cause of World War I? Or was Europe already heading toward war? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of history.